describes himself as, okay, there we go. Reagan describes himself as a conservative Republican. He and Ben together do a podcast that I know some of you have already heard. And Reagan comes by this, I think, naturally because your father's involved in politics as well. And he's highly respected by everyone, including, as you heard from my daughter last week, she's around the legislature frequently, and she knows Reagan as well and thinks highly of him. So I don't want to take any more time. Thank you both tremendously for coming, and have at it. We're here to listen and we're looking forward to it.
Awesome. Well, it's a pleasure to be invited to chat with you. And I hope you're safe and warm and have, it looks like electricity's going. My pipe burst underneath my house on Saturday night. So I'm on day 4 of no water at home. So we're roughing it a little bit in Tigard, but a lot of my neighbors in Tigard actually went without power for like 2 or 3 days. So I do actually feel lucky. Um, Reagan, what is the situation in Lynn County?
As far as I know, pretty good from power, but obviously, my favorite part of the freezing has been going out to break the water for our cows so that they can drink water because it keeps freezing over. I have to do that in the morning and the evening. So, but yes, blessed to have electricity and power. And it seems like that's mostly true in Salem and in Albany, kind of where most of the people I work with are at. So
That's
that's
awesome.
been good.
So here's what I was thinking for our conversation this evening. We will not go all the way till 8 p.m. so people can get back to their regularly scheduled lives. But wanted to give an overview of like where the podcast came from, um, why I like what our experiences have been like doing this, and maybe some lessons that we've gathered from the podcast that could be applied to the broader political environment that we're all navigating. And I know you all do nonpartisan work, which I think is incredibly important in a very polarized partisan moment. But that is not the role that Reagan and I play in our lives. I obviously am a Democratic elected official. Reagan works for a Republican, and we've still managed to become friends and have pretty constructive conversations regularly, occasionally yell at each other, but really have some empathy for where each other is coming from. So I'll start by talking a little bit about the origin of the podcast, and then Reagan, I'll ask you to explain how you entered the picture. So the basic origin, when the podcast started, it was me and my friend Alex Titus. Alex, I knew from college. We were actually in the same fraternity, and I was president of the college Democrats at the University of Oregon, while Alex was president not of the college Republicans, but of the college Libertarians at the University of Oregon. So we were very far apart politically, but we were in the same fraternity. We became friends, and fast forward like several years later. I think our third friend of ours pitched this idea of doing a podcast because the basic pitch was like, you can talk to whoever you want and get to know people, learn from people. And if people listen, great. But even if nobody listens, then it's still a net win for you because you're kind of building these relationships and learning from experts in the field. And it's definitely turned out to be true. The original premise of the podcast was everyone here remember Tip O'Neill, the former U.S. Speaker of the House? So Tip O'Neill had the famous quote, "All politics is local," which seemed very true for most of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and maybe early 2000s of politics. But it seems like post 2010, the tagline "All politics is national" actually makes a lot more sense. It's hard for a Republican in Oregon to win if they've come out against Donald Trump, even if they're running for city council or state representative. Likewise, it would be hard for a Democrat to get elected to a down ballot office if they were, for example, against abortion rights. So these national issues that don't really have a big role on local politics are actually dominating the space in a lot of ways. So we wanted to explore that and see how that sort of like national dominance was impacting Oregon, and kind of just explore it. I will say before I hand to Reagan on how he entered the picture, I'm not sure what I think on that thesis anymore. Like I do think there are great examples of um for example, like even just like Reagan and I's relationship, there are people who I think in both of our parties who I've like joked with Reagan. They're literally legislators who've warned me about Reagan, like be careful. And I'm like it's improbable that we're allowed to do this, but I do think it's a good example of like actually these like this national sort of polarizing political environment doesn't mean that you can't have constructive conversation. It doesn't mean you can't have like powerful local movements, and it doesn't mean you can't buck national trends. It just makes it a little bit harder than it was, say, in the 90s. But Reagan, where did you enter the picture?
Well, I don't know exactly how you guys dragged me into this, but my theory about it is that Alex Titus, your previous co-host, was planning to move to Florida, and he had basically a new wife and growing business, and so he just didn't have the capacity to do a weekly podcast. And if you've never done a podcast before, you may not realize how much work goes into even a single hour of the podcast. And Ben's goal is to make every podcast at least 2 hours, and so I have to hold him back a little bit. But no, there's a ton of prep work that goes in, and then a bunch of editing that happens after, and so it can take 3, 4, 5, or more hours to create 1 hour of podcast. So it's a lot of work, but I was really excited to get to do it. And they were just looking for somebody who had a conservative voice. Alex and I had known each other for a little while. And so they called and I answered, and now here we are today. And one of the great things I think about it was that I barely knew Ben, but honestly, I would describe, our relationship has gotten, a lot closer as the opportunity to do this podcast and continue to work together. And I feel like we've been friends for years, and which is really great. And I think, I don't know exactly what I think necessarily. I think there's a lot of politics that is national and is focused on national. And I think the thing I appreciate about the podcast is being able to talk to people about Oregon problems and Oregon solutions and Oregon politics, because I just get tired of national politics. It's not that it isn't important. It's not that we shouldn't be involved. I still vote and advocate on things that matter to me. But I find that my effort is better applied to local politics because I just have more capacity to be involved there. And there are just fewer voices at the state and local levels. And so any voice that is contributed in a good faith act of participation is usually valuable. It usually adds something to the conversation. And so that's always been my goal, is to add something. I try not to get involved in stuff where I don't have anything to add.
So a couple, Reagan, for a preview for you, we're going to talk about episode highlights, like favorite episodes that you were part of. So I'll ask you that in a second, and I'll share a couple of mine. But I wanted to, and then we'll do some like takeaways, like lessons that might be more broadly applied. Before I do that, I realize we probably should explain. Some of you probably, it sounds like, have heard the podcast. But for folks who are not super familiar with the podcast format, I probably should have started with an explanation of how this actually works. So what does a podcast mean? Podcast really just means an audio file. So the way that we do our podcast is we will email someone who we want to talk to. And like we've talked to Congress people, we've talked to legislators, we've talked to journalists, we've talked to nonprofit leaders, like anyone who we thought would be relevant to our audience, which is basically, political nerds like you and I, who are like, who pay attention to the ins and outs of Oregon politics. We invite them to a Zoom meeting. And the Zoom meeting, there is no audience. It's literally just me, Reagan, and the guest, or sometimes just me and the guest, sometimes just Reagan and the guest. And then we will record that Zoom call, like this Zoom call is being recorded. We'll upload the audio onto several different podcast platforms. You might listen on Spotify, you might listen on Apple, and we'll upload it to our YouTube page. So that's all podcast means, is like an audio file. And my assumption was that we would really not get very many people listening to this because it's so niche. It's so specific. Like there's not a lot of people in the world who, want to spend their free time learning more about Oregon politics. And I consider everyone on this phone call or this Zoom call as part of that group. But actually, I was just adding up the numbers. We're at over 100,000 listens and downloads when you add in YouTube and audio platform together. So it's actually had a pretty sizable impact. There was a friend of mine joked that every lobbyist and legislator listens to the podcast on the drive down to Salem every day and on the drive back, because it is like, like we talk about this on the podcast frequently, but journalism has declined pretty precipitously in this state, and across the country over the last 30 years or so. So there just isn't the coverage of these issues that there was in the 90s, when you had, like, I think at the peak you had like 30 to 40 Capitol beat reporters, like journalists who were working in the Capitol. You had multiple like Oregonian writers, you had KGW, K2, Coin, they were in the Capitol reporting. And now that never happens. You've got like 8 or 9 people who report on it. So I think part of it is people like to hear things relevant to their work. So that's a little bit of the nuts and bolts of it. One item, or I guess like framework I wanted to share with you that I've been thinking about lately, that this podcast makes me think about, is there's an implication that me talking to Reagan on a regular basis, having a relationship with him, having this shared project with him, implies that I'm a moderate person, that my politics are moderate. That may or may not be true, but I think it conflates something, which is like ability to build relationship and have empathy for someone who disagrees with you doesn't necessarily speak to where you fall on the political spectrum. It's more about how you interact with other people. And I think that's part of the challenge of our contemporary politics, is like, even like, remember when Chris Christie hugged Obama when Obama went to New Jersey after the hurricane hit New Jersey, and everyone was like, oh my God, Chris Christie's such a moderate, like how could he embrace Obama like that? And it's like, wait, the hug of Obama has nothing to do with Chris Christie's politics. And I think similarly, like, Reagan is a very conservative person, far more conservative than I'm comfortable with, let me just say for the record. But I also am a pretty progressive person on a lot of things, but that's not really what we're talking about here. We're actually more talking about how you work with and get to know other people. Okay, so with that, Reagan, would you share a highlight or two, like some of your favorite episodes, to give people a flavor of like what kind of things we talk about, what kind of guests we talk to?
All right. Well, first, Ben, you were talking about sort of the moderateness of collaborating across the aisle, and I think that's an interesting concept. And I think that one of the challenges also with politics, before I get to some of my highlight episodes, one of the challenges with that is you do not get to pick typically the people that you serve with in city council, in local government, in state government, in Congress. You don't get to pick those people. Voters of those other districts pick those people. And so at the end of the day, you have to find a way to get stuff done for your constituents and for your state or nation as a whole with the people that have been picked by other voters. And so I think that the idea that any kind of cross collaboration between leaders means their values are less than, less conservative or less progressive or whatever label you're putting on your value system isn't accurate, because it's the system of government we created to govern ourselves, right? And that we maintain to govern ourselves. And so it shouldn't be that the only way that you can be the most conservative or be the most progressive or the most whatever is not collaborating, because that is literally the opposite of what our system is built to do. Our system is built to require collaboration, to require compromise, not on our values, but on the laws that we pass, because our values can remain, but the laws that we pass have to govern everybody. And so that means that they shouldn't reflect the viewpoint of one person or one ideology. They should in some ways reflect a lot of viewpoints. So that's what I'll say to that. That's just my general feeling about that. In terms of highlights, there's been a couple. I was just going right back through the archive really quick, and I would say that the first time you had me on the podcast, no, I'm just kidding. I did enjoy. It looks like I did 3 episodes before I became a co-host, and I only officially became a co-host in August of 2022, which feels like not that long ago, but yet it was a lifetime ago. So basically 3 episodes, and I'm sorry, Ben, if I steal some of your favorites, but I also tried not to steal ones that I knew were your favorite. So one of the episodes of the podcast that I will just say wouldn't have happened without me joining as your co-host. We got to interview former Congressman Greg Walden, and
Yeah.
he told some incredible stories about how he got to Congress. There was a big scandal with the congressional representative Republican at the time in District 2, Wes Cooley, and he basically talked about how that whole thing went down. And it was like a huge look behind just there was news coverage of it, but you didn't get the inside look onto how the game was played and how he positioned himself to be able to run for Congress. And there was if you haven't listened to that episode, I won't spoil the whole thing, but there was a point where if a couple people had made different decisions, Greg Walden would have never served Oregon in Congress. And whether you like him or don't like him, I think that would have been a hugely consequential different decision, because Greg Walden had represented Oregon for almost 20 years in Congress, like 18, I think, and worked on a ton of key legislation and all that stuff. So I thought that was amazing. And then there was two other ones, which I don't know wouldn't have happened had I joined, but I definitely helped make the connection that brought them to the podcast. And I'm really proud to have contributed. We interviewed two well-known, well-respected journalists,
Mhm.
Jeff Mapes and Nigel Jaquist. And Jeff Mapes covered the State House for decades and really has just such an incredible depth of knowledge. We could have done 5 to 10 podcasts with him and just gone through the decades and the years. He just knows so much. He watched the evolution of that media coverage of the State House go from so many reporters to so few. And he watched a lot of the big things that really drive Oregon now and are key planks in Oregon policy get made. And then Nigel really covered, I mean, he's done a lot of that similar stuff. But he covered the scandal that was Neil Goldschmidt after he had left the governor's office, I think. And he just goes so deep inside that incredible story happened, and like even amongst other newspaper outlets, there were disagreements about how to cover it and what to cover and what was true and what wasn't. And Nigel ended up sort of breaking that whole story. Very early internet era, so they had to go. They went up with the story early in the internet because Goldschmidt was trying to tell his version in the Oregonian. It's just really an incredible story. So those.
If you're not familiar with that story, I mean,
Yeah,
and even
have
if
to
you
listen.
lived through it like my dad did, like he listened to the podcast and was like, I cannot believe how could like it was Nigel basically staked his career on that story. There's a
Yeah,
lot of people who were they were under intense pressure not to publish this story.
yeah,
And Nigel tells and Willamette Week was this kind of like I don't want to like disparage them, but they were not like what they are now, where they like are consistently breaking these like really big stories. The Oregonian was the powerhouse at the time, and the Oregonian famously described, what did they say, Reagan? They described the Goldschmidt as like an affair, like Goldschmidt had an affair, and this girl was 13 years old when this abuse was taking place.
yeah.
And Nigel's just a great storyteller, so yeah, I had to give that a double plug, Reagan.
Yep, absolutely. So I would say those are mine, and that kind of gets you to and really gives away my favorite category of podcast. Certainly current events are important, certainly talking to newsmakers are important, but cataloging some of these key moments in Oregon political history, which are sort of hard to dive into those histories. Those are some of my favorite episodes of the podcast. Ben, you've been hosting this all by yourself. What are your favorite or most notable moments from the Oregon Bridge podcast?
The Nigel episode was definitely one of my favorites, and that's like where I recommend political nerds start with the podcast, just because it's such a good story and so like jarring. Like it's crazy that happened in this state. Like it's one of the biggest scandals maybe in American political history, but because it happened in Oregon, that a lot of people don't know it. But basically, like the mayor of Portland, who went on to become a cabinet level secretary in the Carter administration, was serially raping over a period of years a 13-year-old then 14-year-old girl. It destroyed her life. Nigel tells the story really beautifully of like how this trauma and abuse impacted this woman over the course of her entire life, like decades. And then I think really does justice to the woman who has since passed. But anyway, great episode. Um, so has anyone read Fire at Eden's Gate before? The Brent Walth book about Governor Tom McCall. If you haven't, it is my favorite book ever. It's incredibly well done, and we got to talk to Brent Walth. Speaking of Willamette Week, like Brent Walth was a Willamette Week reporter who now works as a professor of journalism at the University of Oregon. I think he's a Pulitzer Prize winner. Like he's a very good journalist, and he wrote this book super early in his career about Tom McCall, who I consider the greatest Oregonian of all time. And so it was just super fun to get to talk to the real expert of Tom McCall's life. In fact, you probably can't see it. This was hanging in my grandmother's house, and it says "Keep out of Oregon," and it's a cross stitch of American Gothic, and it's a joke about Tom McCall and Tom McCall's visit but don't stay thing. But anyway, lots of great stories in that episode. Um, we've done a couple of national ones. I like if I get a book or read a book that I'm super interested in, or if there's something that I'm interested in, like the legislative context from my other hat, then I'll talk to people who I think could teach me something. So I'll give two examples on that front. One, I'm trying to see if the book is around. There's a book by Steve Drummond called The Watchdog. And it's about Harry S. Truman, but it's about Truman before he became president. In fact, it's just about the Truman Committee, which some of you might remember or have heard of before. I had not heard of this until I read the book. The Truman Committee was basically a government oversight committee that was created in the buildup to World War II. And the basic idea was like, we wasted a ton of money and we're very inefficient in the buildup to World War I. And we did all this oversight on the defense buildup after World War I was completed. And it talked about all the money we wasted, all the lives that could have been saved. And Truman's like light bulb moment was like, why don't we do the oversight during the buildup so we can actually make a difference and actually save money and save lives? And so Truman basically begs the majority leader of the Senate to put this together. I think the initial appropriation was he got like $18,000 or something like this to run this committee. And basically, by sheer political talent and willpower, he creates what is considered one of the best government oversight committees in American history. It saves billions of dollars, it saves countless lives, and genuinely helps the United States win World War II. And he does all this through the nerdiest thing ever, which is government oversight. So talking to Steve Drummond about this, I found really interesting. I've been obsessed with government oversight recently as a potential opportunity for Oregon to improve, which is a segue to another guest that we spoke to recently, named Phil Kiesling, who some of you might remember, former Oregon Secretary of State, former legislator. And among other things that he mentioned that has been stuck in my head since he said it was, we're facing a lot of problems in this. I'm paraphrasing him, but he's like, we're facing a ton of problems in this state. But a lot of the problems that we're facing are public administration problems and not public policy problems. Meaning that like sometimes we actually have the policy we need, we have the budget investments we need, but the implementation is so poor, or the capacity of the government to actually enact the policy is the real problem. And so I've been thinking about that a lot. So every time you see a newspaper article about how long it's taken money to get out the door, or how people aren't able to hire people to complete the jobs, that's a public administration problem, not a public policy problem, or at least not necessarily a public policy problem. Two quick promos that I'll add, then we'll head to lessons. Nick Blosser, former chief of staff to a governor, we did an episode that was basically like, tell us what the chief of staff to a governor does. Everyone knows it's a big job. Everyone knows it's an important job. No one really knows exactly what it is. So Nick shed some light on that about like what he did, how that job worked, and when he was involved. And then there's a Stanford law professor named Michelle Wild Anderson who wrote a book called The Fight to Save the Town. And she does these little vignettes about communities across the country that are basically in crisis, in like rough shape, and also where there are signs of hope. And she writes about Josephine County as one of the 5 places in that book that she looks at. And she just tells the story really beautifully, and like tells it in a way where it's not like, there's no mocking of Josephine County. There's no like, making fun of them or talking about how failed they are. She like finds the incredible stories happening there. Like the basic premise in Josephine County is like, could not pass any revenue for forever. So they were timber dependent economy, could not pass any revenue. Services were being depleted. Like there was they didn't have law enforcement. They didn't have like, it was really, really scary. And she tells these stories of community members coming together to like provide these basic services, including public safety. And then she talks about how they actually did start to pass some publicly supported with the majority of county voters revenue streams to help turn things around down there. So she was an awesome guest that I really enjoyed talking to too. We could go on forever. I think we interviewed like 200 people or something like that. And we're still doing this. We're just not doing it as frequently as we did when we started, in part because we've got too much to do in our other hats. Okay, so Reagan, I want to zoom out a little bit and talk a little bit about like, okay, so it's great. We're doing a podcast. Hopefully it's entertaining for people. But what are there lessons here? Are there things that could be used in like a legislative context or a broader political context or in campaigns? So maybe I'll give you the underhanded softball pitch of the TikTok bill. Can you explain that bill and maybe how our relationship or our friendship and trust of one another contributed to it?
It's a good question. So Representative Bowman brought a bill in the last legislative session, 2023, which we colloquially refer to as the long session, because we also have a short session, which is coming up very soon. And in this session, he brought a piece of policy which has been replicated, basically, which had happened in other states, and we were looking to replicate it. And what it did was ban the use of an app called TikTok on state devices. And so it's basically any piece of hardware, mostly mobile phones, that the state of Oregon paid for and controls. And it primarily applied to state employees, basically. And the point of it was two things. It was security, and then it was also to sort of nod to the point that the federal government was considering banning TikTok because of pretty substantial substantiated allegations that it is generally controlled by the Chinese government, and that they not just control it, but that they will weaponize it for their own messaging and other purposes. And we were able to work together on this bill because it kind of crossed party lines. We had multiple Republicans, multiple Democratic sponsors. And so Senator Knopp and specifically Senator Knopp, myself, Representative Emerson Levy from Central Oregon, her staff, and then Representative Bowman and our staff. So basically all collaborated to help make this bill possible. And I don't know, Ben, you were pointing at the podcast as having specifically effectively done that. I guess by introducing us and putting us all together and helping us build a relationship, it led to that bill. So maybe that's what you're talking about.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. So I was thinking about like, okay, what has allowed the relationship that you and I have, which like like that bill, not a huge bill, right? Not like a life-changing bill for anybody, but
No.
is genuinely changing the practices of state agencies to the point like Reagan and I can say this for certain because we've had at least one state agency reach out so far asking us to change the bill because it's taken effect so far. And I think it was positive, and I don't think that it would have happened if not for our relationship with one another.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't have built a relationship with one another if not for the podcast. So what is the broadly applicable lessons from this? These are what I like come to my mind as I was thinking about this.
Mm-hmm.
One is like Reagan and I had a shared mission between the two of us. We wanted a successful podcast. So we would talk very frequently, like, okay, who can we get on the podcast this week? Sometimes out of desperation, but oftentimes out of like aspiration, like who would be interesting people to talk to? Who would be people that would contribute something to our listeners' understanding of contemporary politics or of Oregon history? And I think that's like a really valuable lesson. If you can get two people who disagree on lots of things, but find a shared mission for them to work together on, that is a way to break through. Like Reagan and I can't talk about, I mean, we just don't really talk about abortion because we have very different views on that. And those views are pretty baked in. Like I just don't, I respect Reagan
Mhm.
enough to know that I'm not going to convince him. And I think he respects me enough to know that he's not going to convince me. It doesn't mean we're not going to like we can engage on it. It's just not really going to be as fruitful as if we talk about something like government oversight or cybersecurity policy, like the TikTok bill or whatever. But in order to have conversations about those like sort of apolitical or not super partisan topics, that pre-existing relationship started for us with a shared mission. Like I did not trust or know Reagan as well when we started as I do now. So I think that's something valuable and can be applied in different contexts across our society, both locally at the state level and beyond.
Well, I think the effort and the collaboration, like you said, was based on time working together on other stuff. And I think that you have to put in the time to not just, work alongside somebody who has different viewpoints. But I think the podcast also helped both of us to better understand the other person's viewpoints and put yourself in their shoes a little bit. Like there's a lot of viewpoints that I don't agree with that I understand a lot better. There are still some I don't understand, and that's also okay. We're not, we're humans, we have limits, we don't have the ability to know or understand everything, but additional effort to know and understand people that disagree with you is super important. And I don't think that it's necessarily a taught skill in a lot of places. I think with some of it comes from experience or just being forced to work with people that don't that you disagree with about things that aren't even politics, right? And if we get too stuck, and I think that's what I get concerned about a little bit, and especially was sort of exasperated by coronavirus, and probably not in ways that you could help, but it just put a lot of us in bubbles of people that we just totally agreed with, whether it was online or, if you had a COVID bubble that you operated in, it was probably a pretty tight knit, small group of people that you were talking to, and you mostly agreed on a lot of things. And I think that was certainly helped us build stronger relationships with some people in our lives, but it also insulated us from disagreement. And so it's been rough coming out of, even now, just coming out of COVID and understanding and dealing with other people again, in some ways. And so I think that, and then I also just generally have a lot of concern about how that unfolds on social media.
Mhm.
And generally being concerned about social media not contributing to good conversations as much as negative conversations. So I think the time and the effort to understand the positions and people that we don't know as well is worthwhile, because I think it results in us being better contributors to what a word I had not, or a phrase I had not heard before, Ben, which was like civic culture, which is something I just didn't spend a lot of time thinking about.
So I love that and agree with that. So one for me was shared mission. I like what Reagan said too, which is like time together, because my number 2 out of 3 was trust. And what I
Right.
mean by trust is like, so when we have guests on the podcast, we're like not journalists, obviously. Like we do a lot of things and journalism isn't one of them. But like, so we will tell guests, if you say something on the podcast that you didn't like, or that you think might make you look bad or whatever, we are happy to edit that out of the program and no one will ever see it. Only like 3 people have ever taken us up on that. So it doesn't actually happen very frequently. But it's also like, Reagan and I talk much more off the podcast than we do on the podcast. And like I trust him, and I'm sure I've said things to Reagan or asked questions of Reagan that like if he shared publicly would make me look like an idiot or make me look bad. And I can tell you for sure that Reagan has done the same with me. But like we trust each other enough to like have that vulnerability and be able to talk about hard things and ask dumb questions. And having that level of trust, I think, is another key lesson for me. And I think Reagan is right. It's built over time. My third like broader takeaway, and I think one of the reasons I get along with Reagan is a sense of humor goes a long way. And we often, when we're like talking to one another, Reagan will make fun of Republicans to me, and I will make fun of Democrats to him, and vice versa. And kind of just like be able to lean into like our job is like in politics is a very space. This is a very hard time in American history. Like politics often feels existential, and I'm like deeply worried about 2024 and all of those things. But if you don't approach it with a sense of humor, and if you don't approach it with a sense of like we're all navigating this together, and if the person on the other side at least has like good intentions and is applying a good faith effort, then you ought to be able to enjoy spending the time together. So that's my number 3 for lesson. Okay, so you know what? Actually, it's 7:35. Maybe we'll just open up for questions and see if there's anything in particular folks want to chat about. We don't want to keep you too long. We
I like
appreciate
that, Ben.
but yeah, let's see if anyone's got any questions.
Would you say that the Oregon legislators and senators and representatives are more congenial and more cooperative than our national people appear to be in media?
That's a good question.
I think that you see that most of the time when we observe our Congress people, it's through the media. And it is pretty often said, and a lot of people told us that seeing people and Congress people specifically in media and off media is totally different experience. They have a persona that they're projecting for, valid or invalid reasons on media, and we just don't get to see them off media very often. And Ben and I get to observe Oregon political people off media very often. And so I think the correct answer is, because I've never worked in DC, I don't know. I think there's a lot of collaboration in DC that happens that we just never see. And so it's hard for me to say it doesn't exist, but I can see why a lot of people think that local politics is better. But there is a lot of concern that local politics is getting just as negative as national. And it's sort of connected to the original thesis of the podcast about all politics being national. I mean, there was the other thing is that hasn't helped is Oregon took a little longer to realign with the national politics. So like we had more moderate Democrats and more moderate Republicans from swing or opposite party districts for longer than they did in Congress. A lot of them got erased in Congress sooner. And so we probably have similar things that are happening in Congress, and they're just taking longer to filter down. And I think that's true for most states. So it's possible, but I don't know because I don't have a lot of experience with DC.
I will say quickly, my gut says, like Reagan, I don't have the experience, but my gut says like there's actually far more congeniality in Oregon than there is in DC, in part because like they're all, my perception is like the DC Congress folks are almost always performing. They're always like putting on some like performance to whoever it is, the media, their base, whatever. Whereas like not very many people care what's happening on a day-to-day basis in the legislature. So like I'll give a quick example, putting my other hat on of state representative. Like I had a bill in for that really just benefited my district. It was just about this one road that ran through the heart of my district. And the road was in terrible shape. Like 2 people have died in the last 2 years. It matters a lot to me and to my community. Republicans had walked out, which is a whole separate thing we're not going to talk about. But part of the consideration for bills at the end of the session was like, well, if Republicans don't, like, if you don't have Republicans on your bill, it might not pass if you don't have Republican sponsors. And so I went to like several of my friends in the Republican caucus, and I think I got like 6 Republicans to co-sponsor this bill that had
Which,
nothing.
by the way, is a lot. That's a large number, I would say.
Yeah, it's a really big number. Who like they did it to help me, and because like they knew it mattered to the constituents in my district, and I tried to help them similarly on their bills. And I'm sure there's some of that in DC. I just think it's more common in Oregon, or at least I hope. Mary?
Yes, I'm wondering if you think there will be a bipartisan solution to the Measure 110 fiasco that is going through the state right now, where most of the citizens apparently believe some reform, if not repeal, is needed, and the Board of Clackamas County Commissioners has taken a stand. We are Clackamas County, so they've taken a stand that the measure needs to be adjust to decriminalizing the possession of the drugs and yet retaining the money for the mental health and other provisions. So I'm just wondering, is there a bipartisan path forward to resolving this? What do you think?
Great question. Reagan, you want to go first?
Sure. Absolutely there is. I just don't know if it's going to be taken. And I think there's disagreements about what a bipartisan agreement would look like. And so those conversations continue to be ongoing and they continue to be productive, but I think it's too soon to say. I think everybody agrees that something needs to change. And so that's usually the catalyst for a big bipartisan solution. So things are going a good direction on that front, but I just don't think we know because we haven't, the Republicans, House Republicans, I think have released their bill. We didn't really share much about what the Senate Republican bill will be yet. And then the House and Senate Democrats are working on their bill and that's not out yet. So I think without language to talk about, it's a little too soon to say, but I don't know. Ben, what do you think?
My gut says there will be some Democrats and Republicans who vote yes, and some Democrats and Republicans who vote no on the
Yes.
ultimate proposal. That is my best guess. Like what you're seeing, part of this comes down to like a very interesting philosophical question about like what percent of a bill should you have to like to vote yes versus what percent should you have to vote no?
Yeah.
Like one of the big debates about this bill right now is like, should it be a class A misdemeanor or a class C misdemeanor? And if you wanted it to be an A, but the bill says C or vice versa, do you vote no, even though you prefer that to the status quo? Or do you vote yes because you think it's a step forward, but it doesn't go far enough? Everyone's got to come to their own conclusion about how to vote in that situation. But I think the vast majority of people, including legislators and Oregonians, will feel like whatever we do is progress. Like I don't think it's like there are some bills like House Bill 2002, which was about abortion and rights for transgender people, where like one side thought this was really important for us and the other side thought it was just like a disaster and the worst thing ever. This is not that. It feels actually very different than that. It's more like negotiating over a narrower set of details.
Yeah, and I think also it's likely that regardless of the bill that passes, whether it's 60 to nothing vote in the House and 30-0 in the Senate, which would be a perfect 100% bipartisan bill, or whether it's narrow margins or whether nothing passes, I think it's unlikely that whatever gets passed will solve the problem before the next election. And so that'll be super interesting to watch. I think all of this policy, both the folks who want full decriminalization or more decriminalization of drugs and the folks who want to recriminalize it, both agree that it's unlikely that a bill will fix the problem we'll finish the session in March and there'll be an election in November, right? It's just too soon for that stuff to all take effect. So I think that's also an ongoing component of this is are we actually going to be able to solve the problem anytime soon? And for a lot of these things, the lead time is long, and that's a challenge because people are sort of hoping to get things changed before the next election happens so they can talk about it, which is understandable.
Maureen?
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank you for being here tonight. And I have listened to your podcast and I really enjoyed it. And I enjoy your approach of having both sides discuss things. I think that's really healthy. One of the questions I have for you, because one of our challenges is how to educate voters in a nonpartisan way.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any sense of what the demographics of your podcast is and how you are impacting that?
The short answer is not really. We did one survey like a year and a half ago, where we got we were doing this partnership with like a company that helps media companies grow, but like the podcast platforms and YouTube don't provide like any data on who listens. Like what we can surmise demographically is like these are people who care about Oregon politics, which means we know that there's a lot of legislators and lobbyists and state government people, party officials, but what we don't know is like age, gender, race, and those kinds of things, which would be really useful, but unfortunately we don't.
And part of that is just the platforms of podcasts can't track that stuff, or a lot of them can't. Like if you download, so I use a different podcast app. I use one called Overcast. And so I downloaded it for free. It doesn't ask me any information about myself. And then I just download my episodes. And so basically the main thing we can count is downloads, and that's about it. And so we don't have data. We take guesses, Ben and I do, based on like the people who talk to us saying they listen to the episode and give us feedback. But no, we don't have any estimates on demos, and I don't really know how it's impacting. I hear positive, mostly positive. If there is a lot of negative feedback, they must be keeping it to themselves. So I think that overall probably is a net positive for people to be involved. And I would say the same question that you're asking about, how to engage with voters in a nonpartisan way. Lots of groups are asking that, and even the partisan groups are asking how do they engage with voters. It's just an ongoing challenge that everyone's going to continue to face. And I would say for the most part, there are no right answers. Sometimes there's wrong answers, but you learn those, and then you try something different. So
yeah. March.
I wanted to know what your feelings were about initiative petition 14. The league is supporting this initiative petition on redistricting and forming an independent commission to choose districts. And I'm wanting to know what your thoughts are on the impact this might have on bipartisanship in the legislature.
Can
you
you?
want me to start, Ben?
Yeah, I actually don't think I've seen this. Is it? It'll be up in 2024 on the ballot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hopefully, if the signatures, and we've been trying this. This is the third go round on trying this.
This is the
would take
People, Not
power of-
Politicians campaign, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so
Taking-
I'm a
yeah.
little bit familiar, so I'll start. I didn't mean to cut you off if you have more. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Okay, so I will just tell you, speaking for myself, none of my employers or anybody like that. I signed the petition every time it came in front of me. I actually have it on my desk because I forgot to sign the observation of my own signature line, which is I find very annoying because of course I observed my own signature. I wrote it on there. But anyway, I forgot. You got to do it by the law, by the book. So I'm going to do that and send it back in. And the reason why I think that both parties in different states have abused the process to draw the maps, and it just seems like a big conflict of interest for politicians to draw the maps that they represent. And sometimes those maps can produce good results, and sometimes they can produce bad results. I am interested in some of the scoring metrics on which maps are and aren't fair. I don't know that those get us all the way there, and it's hard to find. There's no map you can draw that's going to have everybody satisfied. However, generally, I think a commission that is, less partisan than the people drawing the maps is good. I think generally that drawing them based on more set in law requirements is good because it prevents, if the requirements don't work, you change the requirements, but you're not changing the maps to fit what you feel like works better, if that makes sense. So if you create a set of criteria and then you try to draw the maps as close to those criteria as you can, and they don't work, you go back and change the criteria, but hopefully we're not comparing the maps to the results and then trying to change them, right? So that's the goal. I think the goals are good. I think there are some commissions in other states that have worked and some that haven't. So my hope is that this commission works, but generally my feeling is that a commission is better than the process we have now, and we can work on, changes to the commission to make the process better. And I think it's okay if people don't agree with that, but that's my personal view of it. It will create a pretty large turnover though, because you'll draw your first ever commission maps. And so it'll create weird primaries between people in the same party, people in opposite parties. It'll turn over the political system a lot. And so the one thing you will lose is probably a lot of institutional knowledge. And so that's just that's just a con that you have to know has to come into play with this, but overall, I think it's a net positive thing.
Not knowing or having read it yet, I did look at the website and I can tell you that 5 people who have endorsed it have been on our podcast before. So there you go. So if the goal is if the goal is to reduce partisanship or polarization, I do not believe that this will accomplish that. That doesn't mean it's not the right policy decision. But like if the idea is like we're going to elect people, like the tagline here is like, we believe politicians are letting us down. Well, the politicians who get elected are going to have the same incentives regardless of who draws the districts.
That's
So
true.
I think the incentives are actually what we need to get at. There's different reforms out there. We talked to, what was the name? Were you on the final? No, that was when Alex was doing it. Final 5 voting is this phenomenon that started in Alaska and is starting to percolate in other states. And the woman, she is like a multimillionaire who quit she ran this like food processing company. What is her name? She left that.
I'll try to find it.
Yeah, final 5 voting, you'll find it quickly. But we talked to her on the podcast and she was basically like, redistricting isn't going to solve it. Money in politics isn't going to solve it. Like she went down all the things that you often hear from people are going to solve the challenge of sort of politician incentives. And she believes like final 5 voting, which is a combination of open primaries and ranked choice voting. Her thesis isn't like, oh, this is the perfect way to elect people. It's that this is the one reform where it doesn't change who's coming into the system. It's not like putting its finger on the scale about who gets elected. It's trying to change the incentives of the political actors once they're in the system, which to me is like a compelling way to think about it. So I'll look more at the IP, but I would encourage you to look into final 5 voting. And Reagan, did you find her name?
I put the links in the chat. I think I can't remember how she pronounces
Catherine
her last
Gale.
name. Yeah,
Catherine
okay,
Gale.
good. I knew you would know, Ben. And I put a link to her TED Talk and the Oregon Bridge podcast episode because we are nothing if not shameless self-promoters.
Yeah, that's right. Nancy.
I remember Reagan brought up COVID and you brought up oversight, and it reminds me of something that happened at the beginning of COVID that really made my head spin. And it was the fact that the Department of Employment, is that a department, couldn't get their checks out.
Yeah.
Because number one, it was a crisis and, they weren't unprepared for it, which is understandable. But secondly, they had these really, really old computers.
Yeah.
Okay, then you think, well, why are their computers so old? And then I learned that the Oregon legislature gave them money to upgrade their computers and they still didn't do it. So for people who read about this in the paper, all I can think of is our government doing the whole ball of wax doesn't work well, when really it's the employment department that is not working well and whoever oversees it. And so unfortunately, the legislature probably gets all balled up in this bad government reputation when really you did your work. You gave them the money and said, go do it. And then they didn't do it. So how can you, in your oversight, since you're different branches of government, how can you make sure that these departments are doing the work that they are funded for and that they have effective management? I mean, that's not your job, but how does that work that you can improve?
I am obsessed with this question. I could give my TED Talk on this question. So the first thing I will, I mean, it's a rhetorical question, but like, is it the legislature's job to do better oversight? My answer to that question is, yeah, we should actually build out the legislative branch's capacity to conduct oversight on the executive branch. To me, the great challenge here is like, how do you make sure the oversight is meaningful and not Congress oversight? Because when the congressional oversight committees do stuff, it turns out like the Benghazi committee and Hunter Biden and whatever, that to me is like wholly unproductive. And by the way, it's not like just Republicans, Democrats in Congress often like are chasing the tails of whatever. I don't think we have that problem in Oregon. So the question is like, how do you build legislative capacity to conduct the oversight? I think there's ways to actually do that with a citizen legislature. It might require more staff. It might require structuring the way committees work a little differently. It might require updating the budget process so that agencies are better reporting their KPIs or key performance indicators. There's a lot of like structural or tactical things we can do. I'll plug a book that I haven't read yet, but I've listened to several podcasts about, and it's next on my list, and it is called Recoding America. If you haven't heard of it, you should check it out. But first, listen to the Ezra Klein podcast with the author. Her name's Jennifer Palka. And Ezra Klein says it's the one book he wishes every policy maker would read. And without going too much more into it, and then Reagan, I'll let you chime in. Sorry for monopolizing here. He says, maybe we need to deregulate the government itself. Maybe we've constrained the government so much in acting out of all good reasons, right? We don't want fraud, we don't want corruption, we don't want abuse, and we want we want diverse applicants, and we want money to go to CBOs, and there's all these outcomes that we want, and so we build a layer of government or a check and a balance on top of one another, and each one makes sense in isolation, but when stacked on top of each other, you've built a very unwieldy system where it takes 6 months to hire someone, or it takes a year and a half for dollars to flow out the door, and everyone is technically doing their job along the way. So it's a really interesting framework to me that I am hopeful will yield some fruit for things we could do better in Oregon. Sorry, Reagan.
No, you're fine. I think a couple of things about it. I think one, if you look at the way the legislature is designed, it is designed basically to do one thing, which is pass bills. The committee structure is built that way. All the systems are built to pass bills, and that's not bad. It's just what the legislature is designed to do. So if you want it to do other stuff, like do more accountability, I think there used to be, or maybe it's just a dream that I've had, I can't remember, either way, a committee that just looks at old law that needs to be repealed, stuff like that. And it's kind of like boring, or it's kind of monotonous, or it's expensive, like Ben alluded to. It's going to require, the legislature's kind of a small branch where we're not very expensive when we pass our own budget. It's a small number. I don't remember it off the top of my head because I had to look at so many numbers, but it's not, we don't have a large staff. And so if we're going to do more accountability, it's going to require more staff, and we have amazing staff that work really hard, but we basically get to make agencies accountable to us 2 times. It's if you pass a bill that includes a requirement that they report back, which is often done now as we try to collect more data and stuff. But the problem is there's only 90 legislators paying attention to that data, and that's kind of a small number of people, and then some staff. And then the second time is when they have their budgets come up. And so Legislative Fiscal Office every 2 years is evaluating these agencies, but guess what? That happens once every 2 years. And so anything, an 18-month delay doesn't get caught until the 18th month when they're back asking for more money because of overruns and stuff like that. So I think, and then also it's just hard to get a day-to-day look into the agencies. There's just so many people with different jobs. Most of the legislators don't even have, like, somebody who's a really competent legislator who's been around for a long time, maybe really has a good understanding of one agency, and they probably don't even know that much about it to have a good understanding. And it's just because they're big. And so, maybe that means they need to be broken down into smaller parts. Maybe that just means they need to be smaller, which is generally my favorite answer, but and do less stuff, maybe, I think would be sort of my response to Ben's a little bit. But overall, it's just something we have to work on and build on. And I'm glad that Ben is thinking about it and working on it, and more of us should be thinking about it and working on it.
We said we would be done at 8, so if you want to drop off, you are more than welcome to.
Yes, please. The other thing I'll say, back to the original point too, really, really quick, was, dang it, I just lost it. If I come back to it, if I remember it, I'll bring it back. But I had a good response.
But I'm happy to stick around, Reagan, if you can stick around for a couple.
I got a few more minutes. Yeah.
Cool. Lynette.
Yes. First of all, thank you very much for your podcast. I absolutely love it. It just hits this great spot of, educating us about what's going on statewide and locally and everything. So thank you very much for doing that. And My question is now you're getting me obsessed about oversight, because it's just really interesting, because you can think of issue after issue where this happens. We
Mhm.
throw a ton of money at something and it still doesn't get solved. So is there interest, are you finding interest amongst other legislators, especially across the aisle, in your own party across the aisle, to doing this?
Yes. So this is I think this is all public now. But there is a work group in the Oregon House with 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans that is just focused on this specific issue. And major kudos to Julie Fahey in the House for helping us get this organized. She's the current House Majority Leader who also cares about this. But yeah, I think like I love this issue because it is super bipartisan, because Republicans hate government waste, government fraud, government abuse, and Democrats want the government to work well so we can solve problems. So there's this like beautiful synergy for us to work together but like I'll read a little list. I put together my proposal for this committee. Employment Department computer upgrade, which we heard about. Employer Department delays in distributing unemployment checks. Paid family leave delay. Rental assistance and landlord assistance getting delayed. COVID-19 vaccination signups online did not work. Measure 110 implementation. Like there's a long list. Each one of these had front page stories in the Oregonian or prominently featured in media. And it's like kind of embarrassing, right? It's not, this doesn't feel good when like there's consistent refrain of like government doesn't work. And so the question is like, whose job is it to fix it? It's very easy to point and be like, look how terrible it is. And like, we got to clean it up. We got to fix it. But the nuts and bolts of fixing it is actually very hard. And I would say unsexy, because it means like digging in deeply with state agency leaders to figure out what are causing these delays, which specific policies, which specific laws. And so that's what we're trying to do. But unfortunately, the committee itself, I think our focus is just on legislative branch capacity, because to Reagan's point, there's a really good question in the chat, by the way, from Linda that says like, isn't this the Secretary of State's job? And the answer is kind of. The Secretary of State's office has an audits division, but the legislative branch is a co-equal but separate and independent branch of government. So how much oversight should we have as the budget writing branch who gives money to these agencies every 2 years? What's our responsibility in ensuring that they're performing at a high level? These are all like sort of subjective questions, right? There's different answers and different versions of the answers, but I'm rambling again because I get too excited talking about this. Reagan, any thoughts before I hand to Libby?
Well, I just put in the chat the thing that I remembered, which is sometimes it is the legislature's fault. Sometimes the agency gave us a pop for a budget that would have solved this problem and it just didn't get funded, or we missed something, or we didn't give them enough money or enough staff. We just told them to do the best you can with what you've got, or with some more, but not enough, right? So sometimes it is the legislature's fault. But I think your point was the totality of government is being blamed when there's like individual failures, which is true. It's hard not to glom it all together because it does sort of operate together as the state of Oregon, quote unquote, but it's a lot of independent inner working parts because we have a diversified and intentionally separated form of government.
Mm-hmm.
So no, that's all I had.
Cool. Libby? Oh, you're muted, Libby. We've all done it.
My question on the chat about the Secretary of State was because I knew that there was an oversight involved with the Secretary of State, but it seems to me like that the legislature themselves should, when they're putting together a motion of any kind, include in that motion how it's going to be taken care of and who's going to oversee it. And the stuff that you have to address when you're writing an initiative petition, you don't bother with if you're busy doing something at the legislature. It looks like we need to do a better job of training our legislators to do the full job that they need to do when they write a law.
How dare you? No, I'm just kidding. It is a good point. I mean, part of the dynamic here is like we pay our legislators a little over $30,000 a year plus a per diem. And when legislature's not in session, like most of us are working a day job or doing something else. And there are huge benefits to that design, right? We get a much more diverse set of legislators than you're getting in a professional legislature. But the downside is each individual legislator has way less time to do things in the interim, like conduct oversight, like meet with agency leaders to watchdog their bill, like to ask hard questions in writing, to read Secretary of State's audits. So there's this balance that I think we're trying to achieve to preserve the sort of citizen legislature approach of Oregon, but also build the capacity of a branch that I think most people agree could perform better in this area.
Ben, I heard you almost pitching it, and I'm stopping you right there. A full-time legislature will not fix this problem.
I didn't.
California is a full-time legislature, and they have all the same problems we do. They just pass more bills in their full-time capacities, basically. And so there's more stuff that needs more oversight that doesn't happen. So that's my personal opinion, of course, but I don't think that solves the problem.
I don't think it solves the problem alone either. But I do think it's part of the capacity challenge. It's like we have to figure out, like, if we want this to work to be done, someone has to do it. But fair point. Margie?
So to that issue, I'm downsizing to the to a small town city council. Or that's the most recent experience I've had with government, is dealing with the city council. And I was always impressed with the caliber of the professional staff, the bureaucrats, who knew how to troubleshoot and could strongly advise when it really is, it's not feasible. It's like, it's a great idea, but you can't do it.
You're channeling Ezra Klein. I'm going to read a quote that he, in his episode with the author of this book, this is a quote from the podcast. He says, there's politics, there's policy, and then there's delivery. And right now, delivery, which to your point is the bureaucrats, is so subordinate to the people who run politics and policy that in addition to delivery being done poorly, the people doing delivery don't think that they have any power. So we need to shift the power from policy and politics to delivery and basically provide a platform for the people actually doing the work to weigh in on the policy side.
Ben, all I heard you say was you're going to empower unelected bureaucrats. I'm just kidding. But that's like the counterbalance, the argument to that is that those people in agencies are not elected. They are chosen by obviously the governor's team of people, but at the end of the day, they're accountable to just one person in our current system. So that's like that's the balance that you have to strike, is like, how much power do you give a person that isn't elected? And that's like a broad philosophical question, which is what Ben's trying to point out, and things we should think about. I'm not trying to shut down the argument. I'm playing devil's advocate here, which I do often.
It reminds me of,
and you make a good point. But I saw city councilors elected respect that they were dealing with people who were professionals.
Yeah.
I mean, did advanced degrees in this stuff. And so they collaborated far more than I expected.
Reagan,
yeah,
I think that's super important for a couple of reasons. Okay. So I think it's great when legislators get deep into an issue and understand it. But I think that if you've got professionals telling you something, you do need to listen to it and find a way to understand that perspective, because they are trying to bring a professional perspective to something that they have a lot of experience doing. It doesn't mean they won't ever be wrong. We're all wrong at some point or another. But it does mean that there's a level of expertise. And I think most people
that goes to motivation as well.
Yeah, right. Their motivation is kind of their life's work and the experience that they have. And so I think it's super important to be respectful of all of that, even when we disagree. And I get really frustrated when people just, say because somebody has a lot of experience that they actually they're too close to the subject or whatever. I think that's weird. Or you just invalidate people based on their credentials, like, oh, they went to college, so they think this way. It's like, that's too low level of thinking. You can not go to college and be super smart on an issue, and you can go to college and not be smart, and vice versa. All those are possible. So I never invalidate, or we shouldn't invalidate people just because of their credentials. We should kind of judge them on their actions and their words, or some combination of those.
Reagan's comment. Oh, go ahead.
jump in and just say thank you to both of you. If anybody has any last comments, it's great, but we've already imposed on you far beyond what we asked for, and we
That's all
really
right.
appreciate everything you've done. I know you guys are so busy right now. Your crazy schedules just trying to get ready for the session. So,
And we're long-winded because we're podcast hosts with no time limits, so that's part of the problem.
well, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. And you made our nights, all of us. So thank you. And we look forward to seeing you in action.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. Stay
Thanks.
warm.
That was very kind of you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
See ya.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.